Welcome to Pages and Pods. In the previous podcast, I addressed Rudolf Steiner's book, How to Know Higher Worlds, and lost myself exploring the intuitive way of perceiving the underlying forms of nature in my garden. He wrote that the clairvoyant perception of living things is revealed as lines and forms. My first thought was the fractal veil seen by almost everyone who experiences ayahuasca, a kind of threshold to be crossed before entering a supersensible realm. However, this is not a practical way to relate to my garden. Rudolf Steiner was influenced by Johann Wolfgang Goethe, who explains a process of intuitive participation with nature in his book, The Metamorphosis of Plants. I also found an excellent podcast where Gigi Young discusses Goethe and Steiner with Nelek Morgan on his podcast Formscapes, which I'll list below. Both Young and Goethe helped me link clairvoyance to intuitive perception. Regarding clairvoyance in plants, Steiner writes, "The clairvoyant sees every growing plant thus surrounded by astral substance. But there's something else connected with the plant, namely its ego. If we wish to locate the ego of a plant, we must seek it in the center of the earth. There the ego of all plants is to be found. This is an important and essential truth." I was facing several problems putting these ideas into practice. Goethe said that to understand the plant, I have to see it from seedling to decay. But some of these plants came already grown from nurseries. I need to interact with them in the here and now. Rudolf Steiner's clairvoyant understanding is asking me to follow it through the spiritual realm down into the core of the earth. But I want to approach my garden as an herbalist, using the perspectives of Culpeper, Paracelsus, and Stephen Herod Brunner. I want to find a way to connect Steiner's clairvoyant experience to these other traditions and understand the spiritual healing nature of an herb. My research into the spirit nature of herbs is influenced by the herbalist Matthew Wood, with whom I had the pleasure of taking a nature walk at a retreat with the American Herbalist Guild. He wrote a book titled 7 Herbs, Plants as Teachers, in which he explains the spiritual meaning of 7 important herbs using biblical stories. Matthew found his inspiration while studying herbology at the Ojibwe Grand Medicine Society in Minnesota. According to Ojibwe tradition, medical and herbal knowledge is graded into 7 ranks, and each rank has an herb associated with it. The society also teaches that there are 7 steps to be completed on the path of life. Matthew appears to have used a clairvoyant technique to syncretize his knowledge of the ways of the Ojibwe with his personal Christian traditions. He explains his intuitive relationship with 7 important herbs in the form of a story with parables, mostly from the book of Genesis. Although I don't agree with all of his biblical interpretations, the stories he tells are useful to developing a personal practice for understanding the wisdom of plants. Matthew refers to his 7 herbs as guideposts on his path of life. The path is not presented as a rigid, linear progression, since life often brings us back to the same problems with new lessons. The book opens up with the following invocation attributed to Paracelsus. "Nature shines as a light from the Holy Ghost, and thus this light reaches man as in a dream." Matthew assures the reader that, in the grandest sense, plants are representations of the problems of human life. They speak to us in the poetry of the soul. This book is not intended solely for the herbalist, but for anyone on the path of inner development. His first guidepost is the Easter lily, also known as the Madonna lily, which he identifies with Adam and Eve. It represents opposition and similitude. It's a plant of reconciliation. He relates it to the Virgin Mother of God as a symbol for the juxtaposition of opposites leading to the birth of Christ, who reconciles the human and the divine. The second guidepost is Yerba Santa, associated with Cain and Abel. It represents the 2 sides of our nature. It also represents the release of suppressed feelings. As he says, the medical lesson of the second stage is that all disease must be driven to the surface. Herba Santa heals wounds, opens the lungs, and purges psychic toxins from living spaces. The third guidepost is the iris, associated with Noah and the ark. The iris requires us to inventory the contents of our inner life. The iris remedies migraines, soothes indigestion, and pacifies inflammation of the pancreas, thereby ending hypoglycemia. The iris assists in regulating the body's metabolism, essential for life on an ark. The fourth guidepost is sagebrush, represented by Abraham. Sagebrush is a member of the artemisia family. Artemisias grow in disturbed lands and areas where few other plants survive. Of all the characters in the Bible, Abraham represents the idea of letting go and trusting in God no matter what. The sagebrush offers hope for renewal and is used for emotional distress. The fifth guidepost is cat's ears of the family Calicortus, represented by Isaac, whom Matthew claims was a seer. He is open to the realm of the imagination and dreams. Matthew writes that the cat's ears, also called the star tulip, presents the picture of one who turns away from the world to listen to a higher voice inside. He claims that Calicortus is prescribed for people attempting to cross a threshold or go through a vortex. The sixth guidepost is Black Cohosh, represented by Jacob. He is the patriarch who struggles with the spiritual world. His name ultimately becomes Israel, or he who struggles with God. Jacob teaches us to grab hold of what we fear and overcome it. Black Cohosh tells us to face the guardian of the threshold with courage and strength. Matthew states that Black Cohosh is a remedy for those caught in a state of brooding and dark hopelessness. The seventh guide is Lady Slipper, represented by Joseph. This is the final stage of completion, of self-awareness and acceptance, of mastery of your field of knowledge. Lady Slipper is a tonic for the nervous system, as well as for sexual dysfunction and postpartum syndrome. It clears anxiety and stress. That's his book in a nutshell. He took his understanding of the Ojibwe path and brought it into his spiritual journey. I gained from his book by bringing the same syncretic understanding of intuitive participation into my garden. I reflected on chapters written by Paracelsus, Goethe, and the insights from Stephen Herod Bunner, who I honored by creating 2 podcasts on this channel. Finally, I prepared my mental state as described by Steiner in Chapter 1 of How to Know Higher Worlds before walking into my garden. The herbs in my garden have found their way to me along many different paths. Some were gifted by friends. Some were dropped on my soil by birds and animals. And some I have planted after being inspired by an author. For now, I will focus on mugwort as a guide for our current exploration of the fusion of herbalism and anthroposophy. Several years ago, a good friend and shaman told me about the experience she had with mugwort on a 1-week dieta. Her journey was combined with traditional and tantric yoga, breathwork, and a focus on the Hindu goddess Varahi. I believe she had an intuitive participatory encounter with mugwort. Afterwards, I planted mugwort near a pond where it thrives. I use it for herbal steams and aromatherapy. Mugwort is an artemisia, like wormwood and sagebrush. It's bitter, acrid, and warm. Her aroma is intense, opening the mind and inspiring clarity. Her nature is completely feminine. Culpeper said she's ruled by Venus, yet she is named after the huntress Artemis, goddess of the wilderness. Mugwort is remarkably plain until you venture into her leaves and see 1,000 subtle shades of green. She can be Circe and the gopis, dangerous and delightful. The prolific Artemisia teaches me to respect the feminine forces of the earth. Her fecundity will overrun my garden without pruning and care. She can produce 200,000 seeds a year, but typically she spreads subtly through her roots. When used for her aroma, she calls in lunar mystical thoughts and lifts the imagination towards higher realms and opens the gates to the heavenly beings. She reminds me to choose my interactions with the goddesses wisely. Artemis stirs the hearts of men, but she keeps her freedom. Calypso, in contrast, bound Odysseus to her will. Nymphs steal away with mortals. Sirens destroy them. The goddesses I invite into my garden tend to the elementals, like the undines who nurture the gambusia, and the fairies who coax the birds to sing. Mugwort opens the gates of the moon and feminine intuition. I balance her with rosemary, who draws down the solar strength of the masculine. Together, they bring harmony. So you see, mugwort is one of my 7 teachers in my garden. The others are oregano, rosemary, herba mansa, white sage, calendula, and tobacco. I'll leave explanation about those for another time. Have you connected with an herb from your garden? If you don't have a garden, you can experiment by going to a nursery or garden department. I think herbs are a good choice for Steiner's intuitive participation because they fill all the senses and naturally heighten awareness. I think you will have a remarkable adventure practicing clairvoyance with living plants. Let me know in the comments section if you've done this. I hope you found this podcast informative and entertaining. All references and links can be found below. If you haven't done so already, click subscribe to get alerts to future podcasts and click like.